live from the studio, folks. I'm Jimmy Selesky, and the big news of the day comes out of the sports world. Yes, in case you haven't heard, Major League Baseball, the MLB, it's in the game, has officially integrated Negro League statistics into their record books. Now, this has led to some monumental changes. Not only have several players moved up and down, been shuffled around in basically every category, but notably, some leaders, some record holders have been dethroned. Now, I came across this news today, scrolling through where else but Twitter, where I saw a meme of what appears to be a skeleton burning in hell. And this was meant to be Ty Cobb. So that's Ty Cobb in hell, just furious that Josh Gibson, a Negro League baseball player from the 30s and 40s, has now surpassed his career batting average record. Ty Cobb has been the career batting average record for almost a century. I believe he retired in 1928. It is 2024, folks. That was 96 years ago. He was 4 years away, just 4 damn years away from holding that record for a century. And Josh Gibson, swinging from the fences, comes out of nowhere and takes the throne with a career batting average of .372 in the Negro Leagues. Also of note, Babe Ruth with a career slugging percentage of .692. Slugging is, of course, like a weighted batting average. You get like 1 point for a single, 2 for a double, 3 for triple, 4 for a homer. So it's like a weighted GPA a little bit. It incorporates for how hard you're hitting it, not just if you're hitting it. Babe Ruth's career record of .692 slugging percentage, which has been held since, I don't know what, the 40s or something, a long time, has now been surpassed by none other than still, again, Josh Gibson, with a career slugging percentage of .718. He was known as the Black Babe Ruth in his time in the Negro Leagues. And now I think it's suffice to say that Babe Ruth will forever be known as the White Josh Gibson. And both of them will be known as the Black/White Jimmy Selesky soon enough, I'm sure. Now, this, of course, does not come without controversy. As you can imagine, when something gets shaken up like this to this level, people are going to have opinions. And I am no different. I will admit to you that when I first heard this news, I, like any red-blooded white American, was, I don't know, a little taken aback. What in tarnation? Oh, they've done it again. Oh, here we go. They took her germs. That was me a couple hours ago. I will admit, I'm not here to front. Not because I didn't want to see a black man taking the lead in the record books in athletics and sports. You may be surprised to hear this, but us white guys are very used to that. I don't know if you've looked into sports recently, but black people are like really good at them. So it's not like we're not used to sports being dominated by not us. So this isn't really what the issue was, people. This wasn't a white man's first experience with not absolutely dominating athletically. It just seemed a little odd. You're talking about two separate leagues, in theory. We're going to get into this later, but the real thing is here, now that I've really looked into it, I actually do not see a problem with including the Negro League baseball stats into Major League record books. I don't. My first thought was these are two separate leagues. They did not compete against each other forever. They didn't. Jackie Robinson famously broke the Major League Baseball color barrier by signing with the Brooklyn Dodgers in like 1947 or 8. Prior to that, black people were not allowed to play in Major League Baseball. White people did not play in the Negro Leagues. And that was that. So now you have a guy in Josh Gibson, who is obviously and undoubtedly a phenomenal baseball player, taking the lead in several categories. When he never technically competed in Major League Baseball. Now that was until I thought about it harder. And one of the clips that kind of brought me a little bit closer to an understanding was from the Pat McAfee show. Now, this is a sports analyst, Russell something or other, talking on the Pat McAfee show, and he brings up this point, which I thought was a valid point.
I think what's really important here for people that are wondering, well, how can this happen? How can you take the Negro Leagues that was its own entity and all of a sudden it is given Major League status? So in 2020, Major League Baseball announced that the Negro Leagues will be given Major League status. And I think a lot of people were concerned by that in the sense of, oh, well, now you're just like whitewashing history. And I think it's important to note in 1969, you had the Special Baseball Review Committee that said, all right, let's look at all the leagues that has made up baseball. So you had the Union Association in the late 1800s, the Players League, the Federal League, the American Association. In 1969, that committee said, okay, all of these leagues will be given Major League status. They also said that no special asterisk or no special grouping will be given. That's why you had a guy like Hugh Duffy, who was the single season record holder in batting average, even though he played in the Players League and the Federal League and the American Association. So for all those people saying, well, how can you do this? How can Josh Gibson shoot up the leaderboards? Well, it had already happened. Nobody realized it, though. And so this is something where the new committee, the Negro League Statistical Review Committee, says, well, that committee said that there will be no special asterisk code. So you can't all of a sudden say, now we need to have a special asterisk over here now that the Negro League statistics are integrated.
So that's a fair point. I looked into what he's talking about. And I looked into the Players League, the Federal League, the American Association, the Union, whatever. And these are all leagues. The majority of them were very, very short-lived in like the early or very early stage. I mean, we're talking like the 1880s and 90s, most of these leagues that he's referring to. Like the late 1800s for like a season where Major League Baseball considered those to be major leagues. Because even at the time, the National League was like the main league. But I mean, in the late 1800s, the level of organization at that time is not even really comparable to what we have today. It's really not even comparable. And we're going to get more into that really for the vast majority of the rest of this show, because that's the really big point I kind of want to focus upon. That's kind of where I've arrived, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But just to kind of clear up where we're at right now, in 1969, Major League Baseball did elect to include the statistics from these other leagues in the early stages of Major League Baseball. And yes, they included them without any asterisks or anything like that. Their statistics were looked at as just as valid and legitimate as any other statistic in Major League Baseball. There's a couple caveats to that I think are necessary, mainly being that many of these players did also wind up playing in the National League, or what were already conventionally considered to be Major League Baseball. The teams themselves often merged into Major League Baseball. So it's kind of like if you look at like the NBA prior to it becoming one singular thing, you had the American basketball thing, and they were competitors, and then they joined together. This was a thing you saw in basically every sport. I mean, the AFL and NFL in football, which are now basically kind of like the common ancestor of the AFC and the NFC conferences. Like, in every sport, you had competing leagues that all eventually merged into one conglomerate league. And many of those teams that were in those previous leagues wound up becoming part of the league we know today. That happens all the time and did happen back then. So it wasn't as if these were completely separate leagues. They were competitor leagues that often played. The World Series was really like these leagues coming together, like the champion from each of these leagues. These were competitor leagues that played against each other, which in many cases the players played in all of them, and the teams were joined into the league and merged in. So that is one difference I will say. If I were to attempt to make the point that the Negro League situation is a little bit different, that would be the point I'd make. Because the Negro League did not compete on any level and had no competition in common with the quote-unquote major leagues. They were two separate entities. There was not a World Series where the champion of the Negro League would play the champion of the Major League. There was nothing like that. So there really is no common opponent or no common ancestor to even compare. You're talking about two completely different leagues where it's really kind of difficult to say if a certain batting average in this league is comparable to a certain batting average in this league. You don't really have any metric to base that on. And that is true. Unfortunately, that is true. Here's the other thing that's true, though. In the same way that one could make the argument that the players in the Negro League did not have to contend with much of the top talent at the time that may have been playing in the regular Major League, and therefore their stats could be inflated because the talent pool was smaller, that same argument can be applied to regular Major League Baseball at that time. Because in the same way that the black players didn't have to contend with the best white players, the white players at that time did not have to contend with the best black players. So that's another reality. In the same way that you could say that the Negro Leagues may have had an advantage, you could say that for the white leagues as well. So in that way, it's not really but neither one of them really count for that much, in my opinion. And you can see where we're kind of slowly edging where I'm getting here. Now, one thing this guy says that we just listened to, he mentions Hugh Duffy. Hugh Duffy held the single season batting average record at .440. And he set that record in 1894. He uses Hugh Duffy as an example of someone who was at the top of the record boards, even though he did not play in what is technically or conventionally thought of as Major League Baseball. He was in the American Association. He did play in the American Association. However, when he set that single season record, Hugh Duffy was playing for the Boston Bean Eaters in the National League. The National League was the primary main league. That is what was like Major League Baseball. That is what became like the National League today. So, yes, Hugh Duffy did play in other leagues in other seasons, but technically, the season that he holds the record for highest season batting average, that was set in the real major leagues. So it was maybe a bad example, but I still see where this guy is coming from. I respect his point. I also think that, you could make arguments for why these other offshoot leagues shouldn't be included in the Major League Baseball statistics. There were certain ones that were integrated and co-competitors with Major League Baseball where the competition was equal. But there were other leagues where that wasn't the case, I'm sure. And so you have a chance of inflated stats in those circumstances. But here's the real thing. Besides the fact that Hugh Duffy did technically set the record for highest single-season batting average in 1894 with the Boston Bean Eaters in the National League, besides the amazing reality of that, it's time we talk about records as a whole. Because if you notice, we're talking about a lot of dates that seem pretty old. 1894, very old. Ty Cobb's batting average, career batting average at 367, standing for almost 100 years until now, where it has been surpassed, not by somebody recently. No, of course not. No, by another guy from almost 100 years ago. Babe Ruth's slugging percentage, again, standing for, 60, 70, 80 years, however long it's been, and just recently being surpassed, not by a guy this season, no, a guy 80 seasons ago. And what you start to notice is a pattern. Hugh Duffy held the single season batting average, and that was set in 1894. Gee, I wonder who broke that record just recently. Why don't we take a look? This is on MLB.com, the official stats. Oh, would you look at that? There's Hugh Duffy. He's in number 3 spot. He's in the number 3. What is the position X? I'd love to know what that is. He was position X? That is sick. Oh, but he was recently overtaken by this guy. What did this happen last season? Oh, wait, 1943. Josh Gibson again? And Charlie Smith in number 2. He was another Negro League ball player. So now that these official stats have been incorporated, Hugh Duffy, his amazing 440 batting average in the 1894 Boston Bean Eater season, has officially been bumped down to 3rd, with Charlie Smith at 451 in the 1929 season, and Josh Gibson, the Black Jimmy Selesky, at number 1, set in the year 1943 with a batting average of 466 for the season. I want to focus on this stat here, guys. You have any idea why I want to focus on this stat? Because I did some scrolling through the season batting average statistic. And I did some looking, and I was trying really hard to see who's like a recent guy, who's like the most recent guy that I would know that's in the running for this. And you know where I had to go? I had to go 3 pages back to number 59. Number 59, Tony Gwynn, in 1994, had a season batting average of 394. Now, he only had 419 at-bats. And I don't even know if that qualifies you for the batting title, because I think you need 3.1 at-bats per game of the season. It's a 162-game season, so I think it's about like 500. I don't know the exact thing. He may or may not have. This is in 1984. The rules may or may not have changed. Doesn't matter. The point is, in order to find someone just in, and I'm talking like not just like post 1960, 70. I'm saying Tony Gwynn, if you want to take a look at this, just to show I'm not bullshitting, Tony Gwynn at number 59 in 1994 was the first person I saw that had set this record after the year, what really looks like 1950 that I can see. See, I see a bunch of 1911s, 1920, maybe even 1940. Okay, so Gibson, 1943, that's the most recent year I see. He's at number 1 in 1943. And then you're going all the way down. I see 1937 is the second most recent. And then we're looking 1939. Okay. 1930. Nothing. So you got, okay, basically, yeah, nothing past 1940, really. You still have to go 59 people down the list to find someone that managed to do it in the past 85 years. Let me repeat that so you know that math is correct. You have to go 59 people down the list of MLB's highest batting averages recorded in a season in order to find one player who played within the past 85 years. Does that sound right to you? Does that sound normal? And this isn't a unique thing. This is pretty much every stat I can look at. Let's take a look at just hits in general. Okay, so here's what I find awesome, and this is a real testament to Ichiro Suzuki. Japanese baseball player, came to America halfway through his career, and is undoubtedly the best hitter in baseball history. I don't think that there is much room for debate in that. Now, he's not a career hits leader. That is held by Pete Rose, but Pete Rose played Major League Baseball his entire career in America, where his stats would count. Ichiro, again, did not play his entire career in America. He played most of it in America, but he played a portion of it in Japan. However, if you look at the single season stats, the most hits recorded in a season, number one, Ichiro Suzuki with 262 hits in a season. That was recorded in 2004. That's pretty recent. That's 20 years ago. That is certainly the modern era. But then look, next, George Sisler, 1920, Bill Terry, 1930, Lefty O'Doul. Do I even need to say a year for that? His name is Lefty O'Doul, 1929. A.I. Simmons, Raja Hornsby. Okay, I'm going down. It's all people in the 20s and 10s until you get to number 10 in 2001, which is again, ding, 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 Ichiro Suzuki. And then you go back to Babe Herman, 1930, Heine Manouche in 1928. And then all the way down at number 13, you have another guy that isn't Ichiro in 2000, Darren Erstad, who recorded 240 hits in a season. And then after that, you got Jesse Burkett in 1896. Who could forget Jesse Burkett? Wade Boggs, made even more famous by the Always Sunny in Philadelphia episode, where they tried to drink 30-something beers on a plane ride, because apparently Wade Boggs hit like for the cycle or a bunch of home runs, or had some amazing game after drinking some unbelievable amount of beers on the plane ride there, which I love stories like that. Like when that one pitcher, the black guy, was on acid during a game and threw a no-hitter. I love stories like that. By the way, look that story up on YouTube. It's great. So I guess what I'm getting at here, for anybody who can't tell, is it is undeniable that a baseball team right now would absolutely smack the 1894 Boston Bean Eaters. That should be undeniable. And it's not because people are just magically more athletic now. It's because at that time, the money wasn't there, the knowledge wasn't there, the marketing wasn't there to have the top talent in the entire world being paid millions of dollars to do nothing but train every day, all day, eat the right food, have, dietitians, nutritionists, personal trainers, weight rooms, complexes, all this technology with athletic equipment and everything like that. That did not exist, obviously, 100 years ago, anywhere close to the level it does now, or even at all. And even, honestly, 20, 30 years ago, it's not even really in the same ballpark. It's amazing the advancements we've made. These athletes are unreal, the athletes that we have right now. And that always leads to certain debates people have, the LeBron-Jordan debate. who was better, Michael Jordan or LeBron James? And Michael Jordan, of course, was in his prime in the 90s. LeBron James is actually still playing the NBA, considered in his prime, basically the 2010s, the past 10 years or whatever, his prime. That debate can go either way, and you can argue and say what you want. But the point that I don't like that people make is, Jordan played it at a time when there was less competition. That is technically true, that the average basketball player in the 90s was not as good as the average basketball player in the 2010s. That is technically true. But here's the thing, what people don't like to think about, in my opinion. That bar was raised for everyone, and the playing field was there for everyone. So yes, every other player in the league had to contend with less technological advancements in sports nutrition and less resources for the athletes and all those things than the players do now. But so did Michael Jordan. So it wasn't like Michael Jordan got to have all the resources and know-how that LeBron James has now in the modern, the 20s, the 2020s. And then he just had the privilege of playing against other dudes who didn't have that. No, Michael Jordan had to get as good as he was with the same amount of limited access that every other player in that league had. So this is why I like to coin the idea of relative records, or more so on a broader level, relative competition. Because someone who is the greatest player of their generation, in my opinion, is just as great, regardless of the generation. We stand on the shoulders of giants, that's saying, meaning that every single person that's come into the world, like if you grow up in an era, like if you're a track star, and this is why I feel like track is really like the only records that should matter past a certain amount of time, because outside of little minor things like maybe the shoes have gotten better or the material on the track has changed, running 100 meters on a track is running 100 meters on a track. Okay? There's not really much else that goes into that. If some guy in 1894 ran a faster 100 meters than Usain Bolt, he ran a faster 100 meter than Usain Bolt. There's not really any way to say like, oh, it was different back then. He had less wind resistance in the 1890s. He had, if anything, it's even more impressive because Usain Bolt has this immense amount of technological resources and nutrition and training and all the best possible shoes and the best possible ergonomically designed track to run on, Olympic training center and all this stuff. And the guy in 1894, who doesn't exist, by the way, this guy doesn't exist that was faster than Usain, but I'm saying hypothetically, if this guy did exist, he wasn't training with Nikes at the Olympic Training Center and running on perfect viscosity track material. He was running on like a farm in Memphis and just was the fastest human being that's ever lived. And that's a record that you could actually compare. Track records. Who could throw the javelin the furthest? Who could throw the discus the furthest? These are things that are like timeless records. Relative records are when your performance is based on someone other than you, aka playing basketball. You can score more points if the people you play suck than if they don't suck. So it's harder to compare people of different eras in terms of raw statistics. It genuinely is. It's not to take away from the people of previous eras. Because again, if you grew up at a time where, let's say you're a bodybuilder. Let's use Arnold Schwarzenegger as an example. Arnold Schwarzenegger, one of the most legendary bodybuilders of all time. Yet even with him, if you look at him compared to a modern bodybuilder, it's different. I would say that Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime looked ideal. Like he looked like the perfect amount of big without looking ridiculous. Like he was built in a way that he was obviously huge, but girls would still find him attractive. Like people would still look at that and be like, normal people would maybe look at Arnold Schwarzenegger's body in the 70s and think, that's a body I wouldn't mind having. He had the biggest normal body you could have. Not that his body was normal by any stretch, but his body was like in the planet. It was in the sphere of realistic. Not that he wasn't probably doing performance enhancing, whatever everybody was. I don't know. Now you look at modern bodybuilders, and I personally, it's like, yeah, I go to the gym, I lift weights, I want to get bigger, buffer, whatever. I don't want to look like that. I mean, it's insane. I don't believe women find that attractive. In fact, I know most women don't find that attractive. So they've now crossed into a level of bodybuilding that has transcended like peak male form. It's beyond peak male form. It's not peak male form. It's like peak freak form. Not to take away anything they do. I have an immense amount of respect for their training and dedication and hard work, obviously. It's just not my cup of tea, you know? My point is that if you grew up in a time like Arnold Schwarzenegger did, you come to America, and at that time, all the bodybuilders look like this. You look at those 1920s bodybuilders, and they look like me if I lost 20 pounds. Like just a guy like standing there like with a handlebar mustache, and you're like, this is the biggest guy in the world in 1930. He's wearing like one of those like polka dot caveman toga leotards or whatever, holding like a stick with two bowling balls over his head. You know, those old school strongmen. And that's what they looked like. That was like what a strong man looked like. And people got progressively bigger. I'm sure by the 60s and 70s, there were several people that were starting to get into the much larger, more slightly freakier looking levels of strength. But Arnold Schwarzenegger comes along and he revolutionizes the bodybuilding industry. He wins Mr. Olympia like 7 years in a row. He inspires a whole new generation of bodybuilders, and he forever changes the sport of bodybuilding. He took it to a level that people did not previously know was possible. And that is my point when it comes to comparing greatness across eras, is that Arnold Schwarzenegger grew up in a time when people didn't know it was possible to do what he did until he did it. He pioneered that. He paved that path. And then every person who came after him got to look at his example and model their career off of that. And so being as good as Arnold Schwarzenegger became the new standard. And so in order to be better than that, you had to shoot to be better than Arnold Schwarzenegger, which means that the bar has been set higher, which means that the next guy who comes along with Arnold Schwarzenegger's vision and determination and belief in themselves is going to set their bar higher than what it is the standard at the time, just like Arnold did. But because the standard was raised so much higher by Arnold, that next guy who comes along is going to raise it that much higher. That doesn't mean that he was a greater bodybuilder than Arnold Schwarzenegger. It means that he got to stand on Arnold Schwarzenegger's shoulders to take it to the next level. Objectively, that guy at the next level is bigger and stronger than Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime. But that's not to say that if Arnold Schwarzenegger got to grow up at this time and had another guy to look to and set his path off that way, that he couldn't have risen to levels far beyond what he achieved in the 70s. So it's important to recognize relative accomplishment. If Michael Jordan grows up watching Pistol Pete Maravich and, you know, whoever, what's his name? What's his name? The guy who is Wilt Chamberlain. Michael Jordan grows up watching 60s, 70s basketball, and that's his bar. That's the greatness bar that he's trying to exceed. And he goes out and does that and shatters it and gets that much better. Well, guess what? LeBron James grows up watching Michael Jordan. LeBron James wakes up every day and he's not watching Wilt the Stilt. He's not watching Pistol Pete. He's watching Michael Jordan. He's watching the 98 Bulls. That's his idol. That's his bar that he has to raise. So LeBron James got to live out his entire career with an entirely different level to achieve that had been set by Michael Jordan. So the fact that LeBron James saw Michael Jordan's bar and surpassed it does not mean that he was a better basketball player than Michael Jordan. Because again, you have to factor in where he came from. Michael Jordan got to here coming from here, which was the standard at the time. LeBron James got to here coming from here because Michael Jordan brought that standard to here from LeBron James. That's the point. You're supposed to get better. Athletes are supposed to get better. It would be weird if we got worse. It would be weird that we made more advancements in nutrition and diet and everything like that and training and understanding how muscle and bone and things, and we somehow got worse. That wouldn't make sense. So you'd expect athletes to get better. That doesn't mean the athletes that came before you were worse. So I say all that to give the very necessary, and I do believe very, very necessary flowers to athletes of the past. However, when you're looking at certain records, and we talked about this a couple months ago when we discussed women's basketball, where Caitlin Clark became the highest Division I basketball scorer of all time. And that's actually a good example because she didn't compete in the men's league, obviously. You know, prior to that, it was Pistol Pete Maravich, highest scorer over a career in NCAA basketball. Now it's Caitlin Clark. Well, Caitlin Clark played in women's basketball. She didn't play in the men's basketball. But the idea is, well, the competition was relative. It took just as much standout and prowess for Caitlin Clark to score that many points against her level of competition than it would for Pistol Pete to have done that against his level of competition. So nobody really has a problem with that. You wouldn't want to see that taken away necessarily from Caitlin Clark. However, there was a woman named Lynette Woodard who played in the 80s and who finished her college career right before women's basketball was officially integrated into the NCAA. It was run by a different association at the time. So Lynette Woodard's career statistics do not count towards NCAA record books. Also, notably, there was no such thing as the three-point shot during her career for her, as well as with Pistol Pete. And we talked about this on that episode. Pistol Pete, there was no three-pointer at that time. Pistol Pete was the NCAA record holder for career points with no three-point shot. Just 2 points of free throws or whatever. And even more amazingly in Pistol Pete's situation, as I recall, the rule at the time was if you were a freshman, you had to play on the freshman-sophomore team. You could not play varsity. And fresh soft team, JV, whatever you want to call it, statistics did not apply to your college career statistics. So Pistol Pete played his entire freshman year of college, and none of those points, none of those statistics counted towards his career. So he managed to be the all-time career scorer in NCAA basketball in just 3 seasons, his sophomore, junior, and senior season, because his freshman season did not count. So you look at things like that. You look at, in the case of basketball, the no three-point shot existing at that time. Different rules applying for what you could do as a freshman. Now, people literally go into NCAA and play 1 season, just their freshman season, and then go transfer directly to the NBA. That's entirely different time now than it was 50 years ago. It's like the opposite. And my point is, why do we even bother comparing these things? Basketball is the most egregious example of that. Why are we tracking all-time scorers in basketball when there was a time before 1980 something or whatever, whenever the three-pointer came into existence, there was a time when people would have entire careers where the most points they could ever make off a shot was 2 points. And now people can make 150% of that when they shoot. They can make 3 points. That option didn't exist. You could make a full court shot from the other side of the freaking stadium and it would only count for 2 points before they invented the three-pointer. That's obviously a massive disadvantage for the people who existed prior to the three-point era. Why are we comparing their stats? Why are people who competed in the two-point era in the same list as people who competed in the three-point era? It literally doesn't make sense. Obviously, you should section these off. Obviously, you should have whoever is the leading NBA scorer for the pre-three-point era, and then have a separate list for who's the leading scorer in the post-three-point era. That's simple. That's obvious. That's a blatant rule. That's a blatant rule that made a difference in a player's ability to score points. Right on its face. But there are so many rules, not just in basketball, in every sport, that make comparing people across time kind of a futile endeavor. A meaningless endeavor, I should say. It tells you something, but it doesn't tell you everything. It doesn't give you the whole story. How many rules have been changed in baseball since Hugh Duffy had a 440 batting average in the 1894 Boston Beaneaters season? How many rules have changed since then, do you think? I was looking into the old school rules of baseball. Did you know that there was a time when not only did you not get to take a base if you got hit by a pitch, but they didn't even consider that a ball? I'm pretty sure it was like a big matter of debate when they were like, okay, shouldn't you get penalized in some way for like literally nailing the guy with a pitch? And they were like, fine, we'll count it as a ball. So then for a while, you could hit a guy with a pitch and it was just the same as if you just missed a little outside of the strike zone. And so pitchers would just freaking nail people. I think for a while, the pitcher pitched from 45 feet away. Not 90, half the distance. Can you imagine that? Now, I don't know when all that was going on and when it all came to be or whatever, if that was pre-Major League era or whatever. Just this season, I'm pretty sure. Maybe last season. But like, if not this season, then last season, they implemented several major rule changes in Major League Baseball. They made the bases larger. They implemented the pitch clock. They have a ghost runner on second in regular season games for extra innings. There's a couple other ones. There's like you can only pick off a guy on first base 2 times. You can't just keep on picking them off infinitely. Like that was just one season. But imagine how many rules have come and gone over the past 150 years of organized professional baseball. We have what's called the dead ball era, where nobody could hit a home run because the ball was like made out of something different than it is today. All kinds of stuff. Pitchers used to pitch complete games as a matter of course, up until like kind of not that long ago, actually. Now, you got like 17 relief pitchers, a closer. Jim Palmer was pitching in the 60s and 70s for the Orioles. He was pitching complete games. It was completely standard for a pitcher to go all 9 innings. Do you think that might have led to maybe people having a slightly better batting average towards the back half of the game? When normally in today's era, you would be on your 4th reliever and a closer who's fresh, whose only job is to come out and get 1 out. I mean, they bring in guys for 1 out. Or maybe instead, the year is 1962, and you're facing a guy in the 8th inning who's just thrown 148 pitches. and is nowhere close to being taken out. Do you think that might not have affected the stats a little bit? There's just too much going on over the course of baseball, sports history, whatever, and that amount of time to definitively say that these records mean anything. And that's really the conclusion that I'm drawing here, is in a very roundabout way, because this is a show. You know, I could have probably said this 40 minutes ago, but whatever. But the conclusion I'm drawing here is that a lot of these records, although obviously it's great to have your name at the top of a leaderboard. Obviously, if you're a guy like Josh Gibbons or his family, who, you know, his great-grandson was interviewed in a newspaper article talking about this whole thing and saying, you know, you got to imagine that it's a good feeling to know that your great-grandfather, your family name has been acknowledged for your accomplishments. Because by all accounts, I don't think it's a fair point to say that the Negro Leagues were definitely a lower tier of competition than Major League Baseball. And again, there's no way to tell. The act of gathering the statistics was apparently very shaky. They're working off of newspaper clippings, and, you know, you're trying to gather statistics from 100 years ago. It's going to be tough, you know? It's a lot of work. It's a lot of questionable things, but I trust that they did a good job, enough of a good job to have some reliable enough statistics to work off of. But what this really drove me to do is look into the records as a whole. And when I start seeing that most of these records are standing for decades and decades and decades, and you have to go pretty far down the list on most stats. Home run is like the only statistic where it's dominated by modern players. Outside of that, you know, season hits, career hits, batting average, slugging, on-base percentage, these tend to be dominated by the bygone era, the way bygone era. If they were mixed in, shuffled in just like any other time period, I'd be fine with it. That would be awesome, actually, because then we could be like, wow, these records really mean something. But when you start seeing that they dominate the leaderboards in virtually every category with a few guys from the modern era scattered in, then it starts to say that there's an inherent flaw in the metrics here. Clearly, there was a time in baseball where the competition was lopsided enough that a great player could accomplish a much higher level of success statistically than a great player could now. A great batter could get more hits, have a higher batting average, have a higher slugging percentage, what have you. That doesn't mean he's not a great hitter, but if that great hitter was playing in the modern era, they may not have had that level of success. It's either that, or we are to believe that somehow baseball players were just better 100 years ago, just in general. Maybe there's one or two guys that play now that can compete, but for the most part, Ty Cobb, Babe Ruth, there's no one that's ever going to be better than them. And I don't know. I don't believe that. That's the difference. It's not comparable. It's clearly flawed. That's the point. Now, a lot of the backlash in this debate centers around one man in particular, and that is Ty Cobb. Ty Cobb has been portrayed in the media. I'd never met Ty Cobb. He died in 1961. Okay? He was born in like 1886. He was gone way before I was a twinkle in my grandfather's eye, almost. But he is portrayed in the media as like the classic white racist guy from the time. I never saw the Jackie Robinson movie that just came out recently or fairly recently, but I'm pretty sure he's painted that way. There was a biography written about him that painted him as this racist guy. And so a lot of people are saying like, oh, Ty Cobb is pissed off because a black man just took his title as the best batter of all time after 96 years of holding that record. And I don't know, kind of petty in my opinion. Not just because, I mean, look, first of all, I'll say this. Again, I don't know anything about Ty Cobb, really. I guarantee you, whatever level of racist they portrayed him in Hollywood movies is not the actual level of racist he was, because I don't think anyone is the level of racist that they portray in Hollywood movies. Like the guy who's in this, get him off the field! Ain't no blacks playing a white man's football. Like that guy, maybe at that time in the 20s and 30s, when they saw a black guy walk into a cheeseburger thing, would be like, oh, geez, black guys in here now? What's going on? Like the average person is not so racist that they are confrontational. What are you doing in here, boy? Huh? I don't really know how many people were actually like that at any time. I really don't. I'm sure it existed. I know it existed. I'll say I know it existed. But a lot of it's a little overboard. Really. I'm reading some things here. This guy says, Ty Cobb is incredibly misunderstood. This is an excerpt from a book or whatever. It says, but what about Cobb's 19th century Southern roots? How could someone born in Georgia in 1886 not be a racist? Another good point, by the way, which we'll get into. What I found, and again, not because I'm the Babe Ruth of researchers, but because I actually did some research, is that Ty Cobb was descended from a long line of abolitionists. His great-grandfather was a minister who preached against slavery and was run out of town for it. His grandfather refused to fight in the Confederate Army because of the slavery issue. And his father was an educator and state senator who spoke up for his black constituents and is known to have broken up a lynch mob. Cobb himself was never asked about segregation until 1952, at which point he would have been 66 years old. When the Texas League was integrating and Sporting News asked him what he thought. Quote, this is Ty Cobb, the Negro should be accepted wholeheartedly and not grudgingly, he said. Quote, the Negro has the right to play professional baseball, and who's to say he has not? By that time, he had attended many Negro League games, sometimes throwing out the first ball and often sitting in the dugout with the players. He is quoted as saying that Willie Mays was the only modern-day player he'd pay to see, and that Roy Campanella was the ball player that reminded him most of himself. So that's just an excerpt from a book where he doesn't sound like a racist guy in that account. And again, I mean, it's just some person's word of mouth versus some other person's word of mouth. People say he was racist. Other people say he wasn't racist. Here's the reality, guys. He probably was a little racist. Can we settle on that? The guy was born in 1886 in a small town in Georgia. He was probably a little racist. Okay? And you know what? That's fine. That is actually fine. Not because being racist is cool, but because people have a hard time understanding, again, relativism. In the same way that it's difficult to compare players from eras, it's difficult to compare people from eras. There's an idea called presentism, and the idea of presentism is actually quite a logical fallacy. It's a logical fallacy because what presentism is when people take ideas and figures throughout history, people throughout history, and hold them to our modern morality and ideals at the time. So you look at a guy from the year 1492, and you say, wow, he said this, wow, he did this, wow, he thought this, he's a piece of shit. It's like, yeah, I guess if that guy was walking around in 2024, he would be considered a piece of shit. But here's the thing. He was walking around in 1492. That was almost 600 years ago. And at the time, he was probably considered just a normal guy, if not a radical progressive. And people love to have this idea. It's like, oh, well, I'm not racist. I think slavery is wrong. I would have never, if I was alive during the Civil War, I would have never wanted slavery. I would have said that was wrong. I'm not so sure. Look at yourself right now. I'm going to ask everyone watching this show to take a little personal inventory. If you find yourself agreeing with the majority of your friends' opinions, if you find yourself agreeing with the majority of the pop culture opinions, the quote-unquote mainstream opinions, if you are that person, who is to say that you would not have also held whatever the mainstream opinion was at any time in history? You've already shown yourself to not be a person to break from the herd right now. And you just so happen to have beliefs right now that would seem very open-minded and radical compared to back then. And so you're under the impression that you would have always had these beliefs, even back then. But who's to say you wouldn't have just held whatever the mainstream thoughts were back then? I would wager to say that far more people than would like to admit to themselves are just products of their environment and the time. It was an incredibly radical idea 200 years ago. I would imagine to think that black people would be freed citizens with the same rights as white people. I believe that now. But it wasn't even thought of, it wasn't like 200 years ago, everyone was walking around holding what they believed to be this insanely racist belief. And just all of society was like, yeah, we're racist as shit, and we love it, and we don't care. No, they thought it was a normal belief. They were like, I have no problem with black people. I just don't think they're, they're obviously not on the same level as us, right? And nobody thinks that. All my neighbors, my family agree with me, so this isn't like a crazy belief. I don't think we should hurt them. They're people. They're just not like the same as us. That's like that wasn't seen as a racist belief back then. It was just a belief. The same way there's stuff that we believed 30 years ago that were not seen as bad, that we now see as bad. In the same way, there are things we think right now that in 20 years we're going to look back and say, oh, that was shitty. But at the time, right now, you don't see it as shitty. So yeah, a guy from a small town in Georgia, born in the late 1800s, was probably a little racist. Not because he's a bad guy, but because people are products of their environment. You probably would have been more racist 100 years ago. And the fact that you're probably not willing to admit that to yourself is exactly how I know it's true. Because if you don't have the self-awareness to recognize that people in many ways, including yourself, are products of their environment, then you don't have the self-awareness to change that in yourself. So the fact that you disagree with me right now makes me agree with myself even harder. But that's the point. That's really what the whole thing is. People, whites, Ty Cobb got his record taken, and they just think he's in hell right now. Just, I guess every person born before 50 years ago is in hell right now. Who knows? That's silly to me. Anyway, folks, I wanted to conclude this episode by just saying congratulations to Josh Gibson and his family. I can understand that it must be a very vindicating feeling to have accomplished so much in a career and not had the option of ever being recognized on the same level as people in Major League Baseball. He just there was nothing he could have done at that time to ever even be in the running. And that was wrong. That was wrong. It was a mistake that we corrected. And it's a bigger mistake than the mistake that may or may not exist, which is a mistake that we'll never really know the answer to, which is, were the Negro Leagues as competitive as the Major Leagues? We don't know. I'm going to venture off and say probably not, simply because the money wasn't there in the same magnitude. The audience wasn't there in the same magnitude. And just like we've seen how money and marketing have improved the game of this day compared to then, you have to imagine that a smaller budget market with lower salaries and everything like that might not have had an overall as dense of a talent pool. That's not to say that there weren't individual players like Jackie Robinson, Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige, and the like who were not every bit as good or better than anyone in the major league teams. But I think it probably is a safe bet that overall the Negro Leagues were not as competitive as the major leagues. But the truth is, we'll never know. And the truth is, the larger reality of that question, the much more important reality of that question, is that never should have happened. But it did, because that's how history works. And it's how we got here. So for the time being, when in doubt, don't leave it out, I would say, is the moral of this story. We can't rightfully exclude Negro League statistics from Major League statistics. Whether that is an equal comparison or not does not matter, because these records are already flawed, as we observed. So that's that. We're not introducing anything new to the equation. We have already flawed records, and now we're incorporating another league that, in my opinion, maybe no one can make the perfect argument for why they should be included, but I don't think there's a perfect argument for why they should be excluded. So throw them in there, and congratulations. Whatever. When I'm looking at most of the records being held by people in the 20s and 30s, it tells me that the records are already messed up to begin with. There's something wrong with the way we keep records. I don't know. Obviously, there's something wrong here. Otherwise, folks, just want to let you know that. My name is Jimmy Selesky. This is Live from the Studio. New content every Monday through Friday. Please hit the subscribe button. That would be sweet. Give us a like, give us a comment, whatever you got to do. Until next time, peace.